My name is Luciano Resende. I'm an open source AI platform architect at IBM Code. Code stands for Center of Open Source Data and AI Technologies. We are a group at IBM that we work on mostly around open source technologies around big data and AI. We are kind of like located in San Francisco, most of the team, so that's where I'm based. If you need to reach me, if you have like questions later on or anything, these are all the ways you can contact me. So like my email, Twitter, GitHub to see like what I'm playing with, and also like LinkedIn. So feel free to reach to me if you guys have any further questions or need any more details. I probably don't need to go much around this, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. I'm assuming that everybody here knows what Jupyter Notebooks are. We are at JupyterCon. But what I've seen, particularly talking with some of the folks, not everybody knows and understands what's going on internally when you're using your notebooks. So familiar with the web interface, everybody knows we go to the web and we kind of like get the notebooks and we execute cells. When we start executing those cells, what we have under the covers are kernels. Those kernels, they abstract the language that you're using. So we have a Python kernel, we have an R kernel, we have a Scala kernel, and you name it. I think that we have more than 100 different types of kernels that is executing the contents of the cell. What is interesting to understand here is that there is a one-on-one relationship between when you start a notebook, you're starting actually a kernel that executes those, and that those kernels, they run and consume the resource as long as the notebook is running. So you went to take go for lunch or take a coffee break, you left those running. If you are doing interactive development on GPUs or any expensive resources, those resources are locked and cannot be reutilized by other members. This becomes a problem when you have kind of like a cluster that is being shared among people from the department or people from your company. Everybody kind of like on the same page. Let's talk a little bit about Jupyter Notebooks and deep learning. What are some of the characteristics of a deep learning workload? Very resource intensive. We sometimes can just run a quick thing, like a simple one, which like Mininst, which might take an hour on my notebook, for example. So if you don't have GPUs, but what we do in the code where we train some of the models that we have there, with GPUs and everything, powerful hardware, it sometimes takes us 1 or 2 days just to get the basic model trained. And yes, like as I mentioned, and as we saw, like Paco mentioning on the keynotes today, requires expensive hardwares, and those hardwares we usually, particularly on big companies, we want to share those hardwares as it's not like very cost effective to have those in like every person's desktop and things like that. Here on the right, you can just see like a very simple one, but then how very deep and complex those models can become, and to train those, it becomes very intensive computing. One of the things that we start seeing more into the direction is training those jobs, doing more deep learning with the support of like Kubernetes. Kubernetes start providing a very flexible way to start packaging your dependencies in your applications. And we talk about deep learning, we start seeing a lot of like various frameworks that are used and with very different characteristics and dependencies. So like if you're doing a model that you're using TensorFlow, or you start doing Keras and stuff, they work differently, they depend, and they require different dependencies, and also they train and serve models differently. So Kubernetes started being a layer to start abstracting some of those from the actual data scientists so that it becomes easier for building and working on deep learning models. Kubernetes also help on kind of like sharing some of the expensive resources, such as GPUs. You can start defining those resources in Kubernetes, and then you can say that the pod that you're going to create for doing the training is using one of 4 GPUs, so that you start sharing those GPUs that are available on the server that is doing the training. So one of the things that we did with Enterprise Gateway to help to support Kubernetes is supporting Kubernetes as a way for you to deploy kernels. If we just look into, for example, what Jupyter Hub does today, or if you're just trying to launch a Jupyter Notebook on Kubernetes environment, what you're going to see is that you have a pod. All the resources that you're going to need for all the kernels that you're going to have to instantiate needs to be pre-allocated when you create that pod. And it will be kind of like a locked during the time that you have the notebook open. Sometimes that is not what we want, because we might be bringing different notebooks up and down. Maybe we have one that is a little bit more long running. So we want to have the flexibility, and we wanted the infrastructure to support that as well. Another problem with that is once you bootstrap the notebook, expensive resources like GPUs, if you had like 3 GPUs assigned to your pod, the first kernel that starts to use that will basically start using all of the 3 ones, and you cannot start sharing between the 2 different notebooks. Enterprise Gateway provides you the capability of like remoting the kernels. And what happens in a Kubernetes environment, those kernels then start becoming actually different pods. So then each pod has its own life cycle. It only locking the resources the moment that you need, the time that you need. And so, for example, if you have 3 GPUs that are available for you, you can actually have 3 different kernels, each one using 1 GPU, and you can start actually leveraging those resources much more efficiently. With this, you start, the actual Jupyter Notebook becomes very lightweight, and all the resources that you need is only allocated the time that you need that. We also, with the ability to start putting the kernel into its own pod, we can make those pods be derivated from the actual framework that you're using. So like, for example, TensorFlow has a Docker image that can be used as the base image for the Python kernel that you're doing TensorFlow models, and so on for the different frameworks that you're using for deep learning. This is kind of like just a quick kind of system diagram. We support the ability to bring your own notebook into this kind of like environment. So you can actually have a hosted notebook, or you can have a notebook that is kind of like running the UI, the notebook server on your laptop. It connects to the remote platform to be able to actually run the kernels, which is what needs the computing resources. And as I mentioned, the images that are based for those kernels are actually become a choice for you, depending on what model, what framework you're using for your deep learning models. And yeah, what we call like vanilla kernels, which is just like a Python or Scala, or you name the kernel that you want. We also support, for some of the kernels, running on Spark on Kubernetes if you're doing some analytics that uses Spark or uses the Spark APIs or some models that are available there. So you have the flexibility. You can start mixing and matching the framework with the environment that you need, and that gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of like the infrastructure. Having kind of like at the same we have been seeing the Kubernetes is becoming very kind of like active in this area. On top of that, what we also seeing, we see the rise of kind of like the deep learning platforms. As we saw, some of these difference on frameworks and stuff, people have been trying to abstract that. And that's how the platforms have kind of like come into play here. And another thing is if you're doing the kind of like interactive development that we usually kind of like so use it with notebooks, and you may be locking a GPU for like a day while you're just doing interactive development, it's not very cost effective for the platform. So if you want to actually start supporting more people, you have to figure out a different way of doing that. The problem with these deep learning platforms, it's kind of like go away from the interactive development into a more batch-oriented development, which us data scientists coming from the notebook interactive development, we're not very fond of that. We want to get the response. We want to get kind of like the immediate result for the things that we are doing. Just going back here. On the right side, we see some of the examples of the platforms that we are seeing coming up. So FfDL is one of the projects that we open sourced at IBM. Recently, a few months ago, it's called like Fabric for Deep Learning. We just mentioned FfDL. Watson Studio have a deep learning as a service as well that you can actually use hosted at IBM, and it provides the hardware for you to train with GPUs and everything. We also see Kubeflow that comes from Google, and it's kind of like very similar to FfDL in terms of like capabilities and the hardware and all the frameworks that it supports. So what we have started working is this notion of like deep learning workspaces, and we see that there is the difference between kind of like interactive development and kind of like the batch development. They usually have a package of requirements, so you can't really like just submit a notebook. You have to have like a Python files in a certain format, and they diverge from one platform to another. How do you start solving that? So with the deep learning workspaces, we started to kind of like trying to streamline and abstract all of that from the data science that really just want to make sure that they work on the notebook and make all of that kind of like the models and the application in general are working okay. So the idea here is that you start doing your interactive development on the notebook as you usually do. You use a certain kind of like sample data, and you tweak your parameters so that you're not really like going to the optimal kind of like results. You just want to make sure that the logic that you have, the model that you have, kind of works okay. And when you're ready to kind of like start experimenting with the full data set, you start submitting and schedule those jobs as notebooks into kind of like a deep learning as a service platform. The beauty here is also that we are not really kind of like decomposing your notebook into like maybe Python files or any kind of like different infrastructure to submit to those. We do the packaging, we do all the requirements that those platforms require, but when we actually start the training, we are bootstrapping kind of like an internal enterprise gateway server that starts a kernel, and then we start submitting all the cells that you have to that kernel to get executed. The benefit of that is that you are on the same environment where you were developing your model. You can use and everything, that all the cells and all the magics, all the things that you're used to and works on your notebook, it will also work on the batch kind of like environment, because you basically just on the same kind of like notebook environment. What I've seen in the past, people trying to kind of like work around these differences is that, okay, they will read the notebook, maybe generate a Python script, and execute that Python script into into a different platform. But then, like if you're in a notebook, you have any kind of like, I mean, we usually become creative into the notebooks. And if you, for example, you're doing a wget to get some dependency or small file or anything out of the ordinary, then it's not going to be part of the script because it's not kind of like a Python source code, and you start getting a lot of like problems. This kind of like by just executing the notebook, everything will just work for you. The way we are thinking about this is that the schedule becomes a service. And what happens with that is also you can kind of like a secondary problem that we see on the industry is that, okay, I have my notebook and I want to start productionizing that notebook, meaning maybe I want to run like every day or every morning, every hour. How do I do that today? How do we have anything that can handle that for us? And the scheduler that kind of like takes the job from the notebook can also like just as a regular REST API start taking like just regular notebooks to be scheduled. And as you can kind of the platform that you want to run becomes a choice, it's simple to say, oh, I just don't need any expensive environment with GPUs. I just want to run in a plain kind of like Jupyter environment, or I want to run on deep learning as a service. So that becomes a choice for you. OK, so that kind of like demos a little, or tells about a little bit. I think better is to kind of like close with a demo where we can actually see how things work. And if you guys have any questions while I switch to the demo, or after the demo, we can take a little bit more time to go over questions. So let me just stop here. Let it make a little simpler for me by doing the mirror. So what I did here, I just started a notebook. So it's regular, just Jupyter Notebook, my UI here. Let's take an example of a simple notebook. Let me try to make it a little bit bigger for you guys to take a look. OK. As a data scientist, usually I'm just going to kind of like do the regular execution. I can go, I'll run all just to see if everything kind of still works or is kind of like the way I wanted to see. So I start seeing some of the results here. This is just a sample notebook that I have. And now I think that kind of like I'm ready. I want to start executing that in the context of like a very large data set. And I want to use some expensive resources like GPUs. So we have extended the notebook. We have this extension where you can submit the notebook. When you come here, we start seeing that we mentioned different platforms here. So it started becoming a choice. So do I want to read on? Do I want to deploy and submit this to FfDL? Do I want to use a DLAS, which is a hosted platform? Do I just want to run on a simple Docker where I can parameterize some of the stuff, or in a Jupyter, just a regular Jupyter environment that is available remotely? Once you define the platform that you want, you start having a couple of extra parameters. So in this case, what is the API endpoint to submit to that FfDL platform? What is kind of like the framework you want to use? So like you want to use TensorFlow, Caffe, PyTorch, Caffe2. What are some of the resources that you want? I want to give 2 CPUs or just 1 CPU, but I want 1 GPU. You can play with that. In case of FfDL, you wanted to give a extra information, which is kind of like where some of this data is available. They use cloud object storage to support that cloud object storage doesn't need to be actually on the cloud. It can be like on your on-premise or where the platform is deployed. And a thing that we have seen recently, and this is a recent addition that I just added before coming to the conference, is that usually when you're doing deep learning, you might have a couple of notebook models, but you also have some Python files that you just import and use those as kind of like a utility functions. So you can also say, okay, include some of these dependencies. You can say all the Python files, or you can give specific file names. It's all comma separated. And when we package the notebook into the zip file, we also going to have all these dependencies kind of like collocated there. So when you run your notebook, and it depends on that extra files, those files are going to be available into the environment for you as well. So I'm just going to head and publish here. When I'm publishing, what is happening under the covers is, depending on the platform, we understand all the requirements and the packaging that is needed for that platform. We do that completely kind of like in a single click type of thing, without requiring the data scientist to understand or know any of that. And it gets submitted to the remote platform. We then can see kind of like for now, we are just integrating with the console from the platform. We are looking to start bringing those information more kind of like a panel into like a Jupyter Lab, more type of interface to really build a workspace for you. And you can see at the bottom the one that is pending that we have just submitted. You can, for example, click on more information, go into the logs. And what you're seeing here is basically it installs Enterprise Gateway right away for you. It will bootstrap that environment, execute the notebook, and then make the results available. When it's executing, it just create a kernel, start sending the cells, and start processing the results here. We wait a little bit more, we will see kind of like all the information coming back. And that is about it. So like if you guys, let me go back to the slide here. Yeah, so this is kind of like just some screenshots of the exactly demo that I just did. So I'm mostly kind of like open for questions. I'm pretty sure you guys want to have know more details of specific areas. So we have a question there. Maybe just wait for the microphone. Yes.
There were choices for the CPUs, GPUs. Is that automatically detected, or can the data scientist go above what is possible?
So,
if I choose 25 CPUs, but my container can only provide 12.
So what is going to happen that, particularly on case of Fiddle, is you're going to have a error during the submission, and you're going to have kind of like a detailed of like why it didn't got accepted by the framework. I don't think I saw any APIs on the platforms that we are integrating that kind of like give us some of that feedback, but it gets rejected, and you have the information that why you got it rejected. Question here? Microphone? Oh, okay, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Oh.
So this is the first time I've seen Jupyter Enterprise Gateway, and I had what I'm sure is a very simple question about that. Can you describe a little bit more how it works? You have a notebook UI still, but with kernels deployed let's say in the Kubernetes option, as pods remotely and doing remote execution for a UI that lives in a different container pod somewhere? How does that actually work?
Correct. So I think I have. For those that don't know what Jupyter Enterprise Gateway does, in a very high-level summary, it enables remote kernels for Jupyter Notebooks, and we support Spark on Yarn. So like if you guys are familiar with Spark, we start running on cluster mode. It supports like Spark on Kubernetes, plain Kubernetes, Spectrum Conductor, and resource managers become kind of like a choice or very a pluggable layer. In that case, it's almost like what you were saying. What we started doing, so like regular notebooks, they run kernels as local processes. By connecting with Enterprise Gateway, those kernels start being the life cycle and the management of those remote kernels submitted into a cluster. It starts becoming managed by Enterprise Gateway. And then for the notebook, the kind of the user experience, it's really kind of like just the same. But those kernels are distributed. The benefit with that is instead of like just using the resources of like one machine and only being able to maybe have like 2 or 3 data scientists doing big data, you now have the whole cluster resources available. So you can start having like a much more users supported, and if you need more, you start adding more nodes, and those nodes then start becoming resources available for running the kernels.
So a user really just like creates a new notebook, but behind the scenes at Enterprise Gateway is scheduling the kernels out onto.
Correct. What happens in that case, when you actually come in and say new notebook Python, that is a configuration that we call kernel specs. On the kernel specs, you switch the kernel manager, and that will do the life cycle on the remote. And we have like kernel managers for, let's say, Yarn, Kubernetes, and depending on the platform. And then it understands how to submit and connect to those remote kernels. But the user is completely transparent.
Awesome.
Thank you. Any other question? So if you guys want to kind of like start playing with this, I'll leave it here, kind of the 2 repositories that we have been working at the moment. So you can start playing with that. If you guys have questions, just feel free to connect to me. We also have Kevin Bates that is working on the same project with me as well. So just feel free to reach us. We either around, we're going to be on the IBM booth as well. And we have a meetup tonight that we're going to talk a little bit more on these areas as well. So if you guys have more questions, otherwise, thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Please let me know if you guys have any other things.